Hello, how are you? Before we begin, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications because what I'm going to share with you today could completely change your perspective on faith, salvation, and the path to God. My name is Elias Turner, and the story I'm going to share with you today will challenge everything you believe about religion and redemption. For 38 years, I lived a life of total devotion, following every rule and tradition with unwavering discipline. But on a cold autumn morning in a quiet region of Pennsylvania, everything I believed was turned upside down. And all of this happened in just 12 minutes of clinical death. Before I tell you what happened that day, you need to understand where I come from. I was born as the fourth of 7 children in a traditional Mennonite family. Our house, built by the hands of my great-grandfather, was surrounded by golden fields of wheat and corn. Like generations before us, we lived without electricity, without cars, and without the modern conveniences that the rest of the world considers essential. Each day started before sunrise, with hard work on the farm and family prayer. At night, the house was lit only by lanterns as we read the scriptures together. My father, Samuel Turner, was a respected leader in our community. With a face marked by time and hands calloused from work, he believed that serving God meant following our traditions without question. My mother, Abigail, was the essence of patience and sacrifice, always taking care of everyone before thinking of herself. From a young age, I learned that faith was not just a belief, but a way of life. The rules and traditions we followed were not just guidelines, they were our path to God. Every detail of our routine was based on obedience. We wore simple clothes, avoided any modern technology, and kept ourselves apart from the rest of the world. We believed that every sacrifice made us more worthy of salvation, that every rule followed brought us closer to the heart of God. I questioned nothing. To me, this was the only right way to live. And for many years, I was convinced that following the rules was enough. But I was about to discover that all of this was just an illusion. My dedication to the traditions of our faith only grew over time. While some young people in the community questioned the rules or even considered experimenting with the outside world, I remained steadfast. When I turned 19, it was time for me to go through Rumspringa, a period where young people have the opportunity to experience life outside the community before deciding if they want to be baptized into the Mennonite faith. Many used this phase to try new things, but I didn't hesitate. I refused any contact with the outside world, and at 21, I was baptized, committing myself to follow the laws and customs of our faith for the rest of my life. My father was proud. My mother cried with joy, and I felt that I had finally secured my place on the right path. 2 years later, I married Elizabeth, the daughter of an equally devout family. Our ceremony was simple, without luxury or excess, just as it should be. We built our house next to my family's farm, had 4 children, and followed the exact script that I believed to be the right one. Our days were filled with hard work, prayer, and the certainty that we were living the way God wanted. We raised dairy cattle, grew vegetables, and sold handcrafted furniture to the tourists passing through the area. Every achievement, every good harvest, and every deal closed were seen as signs of divine approval. But despite everything seeming perfect, there were moments of silence, moments when an uncomfortable question began to arise in my mind. What if we were wrong? Whenever this doubt surfaced, I quickly pushed it aside. After all, questioning our beliefs meant questioning everything I knew, and that was unthinkable. When I met Christians from outside the community who spoke of having a personal relationship with God, I considered them deluded. To me, true faith didn't come from feelings or experiences, but from absolute obedience to the rules and traditions passed down to us by generations. And I lived this obedience with pride, until one ordinary day in October, everything changed. The sun had barely risen when I went out for my morning run, a habit I adopted after our religious leader allowed some small concessions for health. The air was fresh, the leaves on the trees had already turned shades of red and gold, and everything seemed in perfect order. I felt content with life. My eldest son was about to marry a respectable young woman from the community. My youngest daughter had started her sewing lessons. Our business was thriving, and our family was seen as an example of dedication and faith. If there was a sign of God's approval, I believed it was this. But then, suddenly, I felt a tightness in my chest. At first, I ignored it. I thought it was just the effort of running, but in seconds the pain became unbearable, as if an invisible hand was squeezing my heart with crushing force. I tried to scream for help, but my voice didn't come out. My body gave way, and the last thing I saw was the dirt floor coming toward me rapidly. At that moment, everything I believed was about to be put to the test. What happened next is etched in my memory, in a way words will never be able to fully describe. At first, there was absolute silence, no pain, no sound, no sense of time or space, just a dark emptiness. Unlike any darkness I had ever experienced before, it wasn't just the absence of light, but the presence of something oppressive, overwhelming. And then I began to see, not in the way we see with our eyes, but as if my consciousness was being exposed to a truth I had never perceived before. My life began to pass before me, but not like a simple movie. Each moment was accompanied by absolute clarity, a revelation of what truly happened behind my actions, my choices, my intentions. I saw myself in church, dressed in the simple, traditional attire of our community, feeling superior to those who lived in the outside world. I saw myself judging those who didn't follow the rules as strictly as I did. I saw myself teaching my children about our faith, but deep down, I realized I was teaching them to fear error more than to love God. And then something became terribly clear. My whole life I thought I was accumulating merit before God. I thought my good deeds, my discipline, my sacrifice, all of this was building me a safe path to heaven. But in the face of the truth revealed to me there, I realized I had never really known God. And the question I had always pushed to the back of my mind finally came to the surface. What if I had spent all these years following the rules, but never truly found God's grace? The darkness around me seemed to intensify as this truth unfolded before me. There were no more justifications, no more explanations. For the first time, I saw my heart as it truly was. The weight of this revelation was overwhelming. I had spent my whole life trying to prove my worth, trying to be worthy, trying to follow every rule, every tradition, believing that it brought me closer to God. But now, I realized what I had never wanted to admit. I trusted more in my obedience than in His mercy. The silence was broken by something unexpected, a point of light. At first it was small, almost imperceptible, but then it began to grow. And as this light took over the darkness, I felt something I had never experienced before, a peace that went beyond any understanding. And then I knew I was not alone. The presence that manifested before me wasn't just light, it wasn't just warmth, it was a being that I recognized instantly, without the need for words, without the need for explanations. It was Jesus. And the moment I looked at Him, everything I thought I knew about God, salvation, and faith began to crumble. His presence was overwhelming, not because of any oppressive force, but because in His light, everything was revealed. There were no masks, no excuses, no hiding anything. And yet, there was no condemnation. On the contrary, there was love, a love that knew every detail about me, my mistakes, my judgments, my pride, and still, it embraced me. Jesus looked at me, and without needing to say a single word, I understood everything. My whole life, I had confused obedience with relationship. I thought following rules was the path to God, but now, in His presence, I realized that God never wanted me to just serve Him. He wanted me to know Him. The faith I had been living wasn't faith, it was a contract. I did my part, hoping God would do His. But there in that moment I realized I could never do enough. And for the first time, that didn't scare me. For the first time, I understood that salvation wasn't about what I could offer God. It was about what He had already done for me. Then Jesus spoke, a single sentence that would change everything forever. "You've always sought me in the rules, but you never found me in love." These words pierced my being like a silent thunderbolt. They weren't just words, they were truths that pierced every layer of my existence. My mind tried to resist, but I was faithful, I thought. I followed every teaching, obeyed every rule, did everything they taught me was right. But Jesus just looked at me. And in that look, there was no accusation, only compassion. And then He showed me. As if time folded upon itself, I began to see scenes from my own life. But this time, with a clarity I had never had before. I saw the countless times I helped neighbors, but secretly felt superior because of it. I saw the occasions when I judged those who didn't follow our rules strictly, convinced they were less worthy of God's love. I saw my children, young, listening to my words about faith, but realizing deep down that I was teaching them to fear error more than to trust in grace. And then I saw something that cut deeper than anything else. I saw myself kneeling in prayer, asking God to accept me. Kneeling, begging a Father who had already loved me before I even knew how to speak. An overwhelming truth fell upon me. My faith had never been about love. It had been about fear. And in that moment, in His presence, I understood. God never wanted me to earn His love. He had already given it to me. I just needed to accept it. A feeling I had never experienced before overwhelmed me. It was as if a weight I had carried my whole life, a weight I didn't even know existed, was ripped from my shoulders. All my life I thought I was walking toward God, but now I realized He had always been there, beside me, waiting for me to truly look at Him. Jesus drew near, and with a voice that seemed to carry the very essence of truth, He said, "Salvation is not earned by what you do. It is received by what I have already done." At that moment, everything made sense. I saw, as if in a flash, the cross. I saw the sacrifice He made. I saw that all human effort to reach God was useless because God had already come down to us. And then a question arose deep within my soul. And now, what do I do with this? Jesus smiled as if He had already expected that question. And then He said something I would never forget. "Go back and tell them what you saw." Before I could say anything, everything started to change. The light around me shone with an indescribable intensity, and for a brief moment, I felt as though I was being pulled back. The infinite peace of His presence began to dissolve, replaced by sensations I knew all too well. The weight of my body, the cold against my skin, the distant sound of hurried voices. Then suddenly, a sharp pain tore through my chest. I was back. I opened my eyes and saw blurred faces around me. A woman was crying. I later learned that she was a neighbor who had found me unconscious on the road. Paramedics were working frantically while one of them exclaimed, "We've got a pulse!" My heart had stopped for exactly 12 minutes and 47 seconds, but I knew that on a much deeper level, something far greater had happened. I was no longer the same man who had fallen on that road that October morning, and now I had a mission. My physical recovery took weeks, but my internal transformation was instantaneous. In the hospital, while doctors and nurses talked about how my survival was a miracle, my mind was somewhere else. I knew I had returned for a reason. The first person I shared what happened with was my wife, Elizabeth. Still weak, my voice trembled as I began to speak. I told her about the darkness, about the truth that had been revealed to me, about how I saw my life in a way I had never seen before. And then I spoke about Him. About the way Jesus showed me that I had turned my faith into a set of rules, rather than a real relationship with God. About how I tried to earn a love that was already mine. I waited for shock, for disbelief, but to my surprise, Elizabeth held my hand tightly and said something that marked me forever. I've always felt there was something more, but I never had the courage to ask. She understood, and at that moment, I knew I had to share this truth with more people. But I also knew that not everyone would react like she did. My community had always been resistant to change. We believed that our way of life was the only true way to please God. So when I finally recovered enough to go home, I knew facing the truth I had discovered would not be easy. I started by talking to my family. My children listened with curiosity, but it was hard for them to fully understand. My father, however, did not react well. "This is nothing but an illusion, Elias," he said firmly. "What you saw was a delusion, a test. Our faith has always been about obedience, and you're being led astray by emotions." I understood his fear. After all, I would have had the same reaction months ago, but I couldn't deny what I had experienced. So I began talking about what Jesus had shown me, about the difference between following rules and truly knowing God, about the freedom that comes when we realize we were never called to earn God's love, just to receive it. Not everyone accepted it. Some simply listened in silence, unsure of what to think. Others became uncomfortable and avoided further conversations. But to my surprise, some began to ask questions. The questions started timidly, almost as if they were afraid of the answer. "Are you saying that our traditions don't matter anymore?" one of my cousins asked one night, after a long conversation about what I had experienced. I shook my head. That's not it. Our traditions can be beautiful. They can help us remember who we are and what we value, but they were never the way to God. I saw confusion in his eyes, the same confusion I had felt when I realized everything I believed about salvation was incomplete. And then, something happened that I never expected. One of the elders in the community, a rigid man, respected, even feared, looked at me with a different gleam in his eye. "I've never been sure if it was enough," he confessed, in a tone almost inaudible. "I've always wondered if I was really accepted by God, or if I was just trying to be." Those words struck me like a lightning bolt. I was not alone. There were others like me, carrying the fear in their hearts of never being good enough, but who never dared question. And now, the truth Jesus revealed to me was beginning to find hearts that were ready to hear it, but not everyone was ready to listen. The conversations that were once only between friends and family started to spread, and it didn't take long for the leaders of the community to call me for a meeting. The bishop looked at me with concern. "Elias, what you are teaching is causing unrest. It is making people question what has always been sacred to us." I took a deep breath. "I'm not trying to destroy anything, but I can't deny what I saw, what Jesus showed me." There was a long silence in the room. Some looked at me disapprovingly, others with pity. Then one of the leaders crossed his arms and coldly said, "If what you say is true, then everything we've lived up until now was wrong." I knew that question would come, and I knew the answer was not simple. "Not wrong," I replied, choosing my words carefully, "but incomplete." I saw looks crossing, whispers beginning. The bishop leaned forward. "And are you willing to risk everything for this? Your family, your position, your life among us?" I looked at each one there. Men who knew my story, my faith, my dedication. And then, with a certainty that could only have come from the experience I had lived, I answered, "If this truth costs me everything, still, I cannot hide it." My answer was met with a heavy silence. I knew what that meant. Being a questioner in our community was dangerous. Those who challenged the traditions could be admonished, isolated, or even excluded. And that's exactly what happened. The following week, the bishop came to my house. He wasn't alone. Other church leaders were with him, and their serious faces already told me everything before they even said a word. "Elias, we've listened to you. We tried to understand," the bishop began, with a genuinely sad tone. "But what you're teaching goes against everything we believe. If you keep spreading these ideas, we'll have to make a difficult decision." I knew what was coming next. He paused, as if giving me one last chance to back down. But I couldn't. "I'm not spreading ideas," I replied. "I'm telling what I saw, what Jesus showed me. I can't pretend it didn't happen." The bishop sighed heavily. "Then, Elias, as of today, you are no longer part of our community." My hands trembled, but my heart was at peace. I had lost everything I knew, my position, my home, the life I had spent years building. But for the first time, I knew I was truly free. Being cast out of the community was like losing the ground beneath my feet. For all my life, my identity had been tied to that place, those people, that way of life. Now, I was alone. My family suffered. Elizabeth cried for days. My children were confused, not understanding why our world had changed so suddenly. Years of friends stopped greeting us. People who had visited us before now looked away when they passed by our house. But even in the midst of this pain, something inside me remained firm. Because now I knew the truth. And that truth couldn't be erased by fear, isolation, or judgment. I knew my mission wasn't over, so I began searching for those who had heard my words and felt the same discomfort I had before my experience. And little by little, something unexpected started to happen. Others began to approach, at first, discreetly. A young man who had doubts, a woman who never felt good enough, a man who had spent years trying to understand if he was truly loved by God. They wanted to know more. They wanted to hear what I had to say. And without realizing it, without planning, a new community began to be born. Being cast out of the community was painful. I lost friends, the respect of many, and the life I had spent years building. But for the first time, I felt that I was truly free. My family suffered, but together we found strength in the truth that we now knew. What began as a loss soon transformed into a new beginning. Little by little, others began to approach. People who, like me, carried doubts, fears, and a sincere desire to know God beyond the rules. Without realizing it, a new community was born. Today, years later, we still live simply. We still value hard work, family, and faith. But now, we do it not out of fear or obligation, but out of love and gratitude. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Salvation was never in the rules, but in grace. And this grace is already yours. The question is, are you ready to receive it? Because maybe, just like me, you've spent your whole life trying to be good enough, trying to follow every rule, trying to prove you deserve God's love. But what if I told you that you don't need to prove anything? What if, in fact, God already loves you completely, just as you are? The only thing He expects from you is that you stop trying to earn what He has already given you. The choice is before you. Will you continue carrying the weight of trying to be worthy? Or will you accept, once and for all, that God's love was never something to be earned, but rather a gift that only needs to be received? If this story made sense to you, if it awakened something in your heart, I want to invite you to reflect on this. Maybe, just like me, you've spent your life trying to fit in, trying to follow the rules, trying to be good enough. But the truth is, God never asked that from you. He just wants you to truly know Him. If this message touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to continue following stories that make us see life differently, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for following me until here. See you next time.